Ladies and gentlemen, my dear brothers and sisters, we are going for a topic uh, the theory of taxation. Theory of taxation is going to be presented by Mr. Daniel Berman. Is an entrepreneur who started his career at such a tender age of 12 years, is a founding director of Taxation Theft. I would have put on that cap, but I've been restrained somehow. And Mr. Berman is an advocate for a free and prosperous society. As I've told you, he's an entrepreneur and a community-based think tank. Above all, and most importantly, it's a great pleasure to let you know, if you allow me, Mr. Berman, to notify this audience here that is a presidential aspirant of the USA on the Libertarian Party ticket. You see, God is making. I don't care about the year, so long as an aspirant. I think I have the privilege. It's 2020. Oh, 2020. You see, Gilbert is a diplomat, and I'm not a diplomat. So I just take what is. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Mr. Daniel Berman.
Thank you. Can anybody guess what taxation is? There we go, theft. So there are a lot of things wrong in the world, all kinds of problems. And why is this the one that I choose to focus on the most? This is the big hat that I usually wear around. It's kind of hot for that today, but this message right here I think is one of the most important, because most of the problems in our world, they all come from taxation. And I know that's kind of a weird statement, right? Like, how many of you pay taxes? A lot of taxes. Okay, so I saw a few hands that didn't go up, but what's interesting is you probably are paying taxes, but for some people, they think they're not paying a lot of taxes. They're actually paying a lot more than they know they're paying. So for example, when you buy something, in Uganda you have the, is it the IVA that you call it? The value added tax? So when you buy things, in some countries, they'll give you a price on the shelf, and then you take it and they ring it up at the counter, and then they tell you, oh, you owe us this much money, and it's more. Why is the number more? Well, they're adding the tax on it there. So you get your receipt and it says, oh, here's a 10% tax, and everybody knows it's there. Here, it's not so much like that. The tax is already paid. So when you're buying a product from a store right now, you're giving money to the government, more money. And it doesn't seem like it because it's all in the price, but really what does that mean to you is that when you go and you buy a product, you buy a bottle of water, you buy food, you buy gasoline, petrol, whatever it is, all those are more expensive now because all those taxes that are built in that most people don't even know about. Do you guys pay attention to most of the taxes that when you buy things like that, petrol products? No, not a whole lot. So the problem with this is you're giving lots more money to the government. And depending on the government, they can do whatever they want with this money. Sometimes they do good, sometimes they do bad. What's really dangerous about this is it's kind of like gambling, right? Does anybody gamble? I know they have a lot of casinos around here. Just one? So why? Because it's not a smart thing to do, right? Nobody puts a lot of money in slot machines or gambles a lot, because why? The chances are you're going to lose. Sometimes you might win a little bit, but the chances are you're going to lose. And the way government works is really the same, because you're giving money, you're giving power You're giving all this to government for the trust that someday they're going to come around and do something for you, but there's no guarantee. You don't have anything in writing that says, I'm going to pay this tax, and when I need your help, you're going to guarantee me something in return. Except, of course, for some smaller programs in the United States, there's the Social Security program. That one does come with a guarantee. But it's just a guarantee of words, because the reality is they're guaranteeing that you're going to pay them every month. Every time you get a paycheck from your job, you're going to give money to the government, and they promise you when you turn 60 or 65, and they keep raising the age, so that, you know, I'm almost 65. I'm going to get this new retirement check now. Now they're going to raise the age to 70. It's a guarantee, but they keep changing the terms. So even the guarantee is not worth a whole lot, right? So taxation is really the core of this. This is, if you're able to say no to taxation, if you're able to say, I'm not going to give you any taxes, you don't have that power. You keep that control. You decide what that money is spent for. And we look at a lot of things like that the government does provide. So, for example, roads. Does the government build a lot of roads around here? Is that the government that does most of those projects? No? When I see some construction on the main road over here, is that the government doing it, or is that someone else? It's from China. Okay. So it's not even your own government that's doing it. So what's interesting is in the US, everybody gives credit to the roads, to the government. But the reality is it's people giving money to the government so that they can build roads. Now, for every dollar that you give to the government to say, hey, this is for roads, go build some roads. Well, government has a lot of employees that a lot just sit around doing nothing. So that dollar you give them has to pay for a lot of people to sit around and do nothing. So by the time it actually gets to building the roads, you put in $1, but maybe 5 cents actually gets to the road. And this is like this with all other government programs. So a lot of places they'll pay money to the government for health care, but all the money disappears, and then by the time people actually need health care, the government just pays for a small piece of it, or they give you really bad care, or they make you wait in line for years for a surgery that you need, and a lot of people die waiting. So if you were not to give that money to government, and you were to say, okay, I'm going to keep this money for myself, and I'm going to decide how to spend this money. I'm going to decide that my neighborhood has a pothole that needs to be filled. I'm going to pay for that because it's right in front of my house. Why not? Or I know somebody who's sick, or I'm sick, and I have all this money that I haven't given to the government. I can solve my own problems. So we look at the way that this trust relationship works, and is it really working? How many of you here have read the Constitution for Uganda? Anybody? 2, 3, 5? Nobody's read the whole thing? So what's interesting, I was reading it this morning, and it's pretty long compared to what the US has. And then you saw a quote from the Declaration of Independence earlier. What's interesting about a constitution is this is supposed to be the document that says what the government is allowed to do and what it's not allowed to do. This is the document that creates this new organization called government. Government is a pretty interesting organization because at the end of the day, it's just a bunch of people in a building, right? It's not magic. It doesn't have any special magic superpowers, right? It's just a bunch of people sitting in a room making up rules. And the Constitution is kind of your foundation, the foundation that says, okay, whatever rules we make have to fit within this Constitution. And it doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes they go outside of the lines. But what's really important to remember is that Constitution, it's very much like a contract. And usually when it's passed, they put a bunch of signatures at the bottom. Those are all the people who are saying, this is how we want to govern ourselves, how we want to govern this government. But is your signature, is anybody here have a signature on the Constitution? So you didn't actually agree to that. A few other people agreed to it. And does anybody know who all those people are? So do they know who you are? And I know the current Constitution that you have is a few years old. So it was written by I think it was the current constitution you have is in the 70s, right? Is that right? 95, okay. So that just makes it about 20 years old. The people who signed that, did they know who you were? So how are they going to create this thing and say that we're going to create all these different rules, and somehow all of the people who some of them haven't even been born yet are now a part of this thing, this Constitution? And I thought what was really interesting when I was reading your Constitution, the US Constitution is interesting because it says it makes only rules for the government. It leaves the people out of it, because the understanding was these are rules for the government. The government can only make rules for itself. It can't make rules for the people because, as they were talking about sovereignty earlier, the human, the individual, the people, us, there's nothing higher than us. The government is not higher than us. It's not superior to us. So the US Constitution doesn't say anything about the people. But the Uganda Constitution, the very last item that it says is duties of citizens. So now your Constitution says you're obligated to a part of this. You have to participate in this program, and it has different rules of things of how you should behave and what you should do. So if I were to ask you today if I were to give you a stack of papers and say, don't read this, sign the last page, would anybody here do it? Okay, so if this is the case, and this is like the current Constitution here, you didn't sign it, you don't know what's in it, can somebody come to you and say, well, you're part of this contract, so whatever these laws say, whatever this Constitution says, you have to follow it because you're part of this contract? Does that make sense? So you should say no to that, right? So what's really interesting, we're separate, right? We're separate from government. There's us and there's them. And there's a lot of really different interesting arguments that people have made about government and what rights government has and what it should and shouldn't do. But I want to give an interesting perspective from the United States. So, and actually I'm going to relate this to Uganda, because in Uganda I was looking up your income tax. Does anybody know about the income tax here? No? So it's interesting because the income tax doesn't actually apply to your income as if you were to have a job. In different places, what income means is a little bit different. But according to the Uganda income tax, it only applies to income that's made by foreigners or businesses or people working for the government. Certain limited activities are considered taxable income. Now in the United States, and there's a lot of dispute on this. Some people say that this is not the case, some people say that it is the case, and people are willing to fight each other to the death over whether or not this is the case. But a lot of people say, and I've done a lot of digging through the laws themselves, that the income tax in the United States is very much the same as in Uganda. It doesn't apply to most people. It doesn't apply to your jobs. But there's an organization called the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service. Has anybody heard of it in the US? This is the organization that basically goes around and collects income tax from people. Now what's interesting is most people by this dispute are not supposed to pay this tax, but they pay it anyway. And a lot of people, when they find out they're not supposed to pay this tax, they still pay it anyway because they're afraid of the IRS. The IRS has become this boogeyman, this big scary government agency that nobody even wants to say the words taxation is theft, because they're afraid if they just speak those words, the IRS is going to pop up from behind them and say, oh, well, we're going to audit you. We're going to make you prove what you have and what you don't have, and we're going to make your life miserable trying to figure out whether or not you've been sneaking a few extra dollars into your own pocket. The money that you earned for yourself that you're putting into your own pocket, we're gonna make you miserable trying to figure out if you've been keeping a little bit extra for yourself. So everybody's afraid of this. And what we need to be understanding of and we need to be vigilant of is when things like this change, we need to be on the lookout for it. Because in the United States, the income tax started over 100 years ago as something that was only for big corporations. It was only going to be a tax on big corporations. But once they created it, it kept expanding and expanding. And once you have a law that says you can have a tax, that's usually the hardest part for them to do. But once the tax is there, for them to change it, for them to increase it, it's a lot easier for them because the tax is already there. People are already getting used to paying a tax every year, at the end of every paycheck, whenever they go to the grocery store to buy food. Everybody's already paying that tax. So when they increase that tax, most people don't even know. They just think things are getting more expensive. So there's another tax. It's called the hidden tax. It's actually inflation. And does anybody know how inflation works? No? Okay, so basically what happens is, well, let me ask you this first. What is money? What is money? Any accepted medium of exchange. Okay, that's good. But why is it the accepted medium of exchange? What makes it, why, when you give me this paper with numbers printed on it, why would I want to take this paper in exchange for something? Because it's legal tender. That's another good point. I'll talk about that in a second. Before legal tender, if there was, so here's the thing. This paper it's just paper. Like you've got a whole stack full of paper. If you were a good artist, you could draw some money on that paper and you could go around and say, hey, take this money from me. And most people would look at you like you're crazy and say, I don't want that. That's just paper. You just drew that. But then the government comes along and says, oh, she's giving you this paper. This is legal tender. You have to accept this money. Or else, if you don't, we'll lock you up or, whatever the government will do. So there's legal tender. But before there was legal tender, it was value. People would exchange money because it was valuable. So if I have my hat and I want to sell you my hat, I'm not going to sell it. I'm not just going to give it away, but I'll sell it to you for something that's valuable to me. And that can be exchanged. I can give it to you for food so that I can have food to eat. I can give it to you in exchange for gold or silver or something that's considered valuable to a lot of people, knowing that I can take that gold or silver to someone else and exchange it for something else. So value was what's really important. But what happened from there is people said, hey, this gold and silver, these coins, seashells sometimes, they're hard to carry around. This is a lot. This is a lot to exchange. It's hard to keep track of. Let's do this. Let's put it in a storage room somewhere, and let's create paper. And we'll use the paper instead because it's easier. And so this is how we created paper money with numbers on it. It's easier. You don't have to carry the gold around. You just have this paper. And at any time, you could go back and you could exchange the paper back for the gold. That was the guarantee. And it was like this for a while in the US. And eventually they said, no more. We're not going to do this. That paper is it's just paper. And everyone got used to spending the paper. So now everybody didn't pay attention to the transition between paper being worth gold and just paper. So now it's just paper. And then the government said, by law, you have to accept that paper. If you're selling something and somebody wants to buy it with paper, you have to take that paper. So now what happens is the US dollar is used in the way that gold used to be used by putting that in vaults. So a lot of countries around the world, they use the US dollar as a reserve currency. So now there's paper printed on top of paper. One paper represents another paper. Do you know the reserve currency for Uganda? It's the dollar? Okay. So, and sometimes what they'll do is they'll use different currencies. Sometimes they'll use a mix of gold and dollars. It's different. But I started talking about inflation. So this is where inflation comes in. When this was originally paper backed by something, right? One piece of paper matches one piece of gold. Now it's 1 Ugandan shilling equals some number of US dollars. What happens when they start printing more? If they just say, well, we need more shillings, let's just print more shillings, then what happens? The shillings become worth less because there's more of them. So if you look at the example back to gold, right? If you have 10 pieces of gold in a vault and 10 pieces of paper to represent that gold, each one of those pieces of paper represents one piece of gold. But what happens when they print extra paper? What happens when there's 20 pieces of paper and still only 10 pieces of gold? Somebody's going to come along and say, I would like to exchange this paper back for this gold. And they're going to say, well, we printed more paper, so we can only give you half of what it's worth. So now the person who used to have one piece of paper and thought it was worth one piece of gold, it's now only worth a half a piece of gold. And in the same way, the Uganda shilling and many countries around the world are doing the same thing. Whenever the government says, well, we can't tax the people any harder right now because they're already paying a lot of taxes and they won't stand for it. How else can we raise money? Let's just print more. Why not? It's free money. We're just printing it. And then they go out and spend it. Now, the reason I call this the invisible tax is if you have 10,000 shillings in your pocket and they print more, you still have 10,000 shillings in your pocket, but you were just robbed. Because with inflation, prices go up, which means those 10,000 shillings that you had will now buy less. So those 10,000 shillings might have been worth, what's that, like, is that a meal, more or less? A few meals? What's that? I'm still trying to do the conversion. What's 10,000 worth? A kilo of meat? Okay. So now you have 10,000 and you're expecting to buy a kilo of meat. And then there's some inflation. And you get to the store and you have your 10,000 and they say, oh, sorry, you can't have a kilo of meat. You can only have 0.9 kilos. You have to have less because of inflation. So it's a tax. They could just go into your pocket and say, we're going to take, you have 10,000, give us 1,000. Now you only have 9,000. It's the same thing. Because that 9,000 at the original price would buy you 0.9 kilos, right? So it's essentially the same thing. It's another form of theft, but you're stealing without anybody even knowing. So this is why, if anyone were to define theft, how would you define it? Does anyone want to take a guess? Just theft. Illegal taking from someone. Okay, let's talk about in a world where we're not concerned about illegal because of what some people wrote on a piece of paper and said you can or cannot do. So let's forget the word illegal. What's the actual act that happens? It's forceful. Yeah, you're taking. Right, forceful act of taking from somebody without their consent. And that's usually where some people end that definition. I go a little bit further and I say it's taking from somebody without their consent or without their knowledge. Because they might not resist you, but they might not know it's happening. If you leave your wallet on a table and somebody takes money out of your wallet, that's theft, but you don't even know about it. You might not even, maybe they take a little bit and you go on for the rest of the day, the rest of the week, and you don't even notice a little bit of money is missing. But it's still theft, right? So taxation is the government's word for theft. When they say we're going to create a tax, all they're doing is they're saying we're going to take from you. We haven't earned it. We haven't done anything for you, but we're going to take it, whether you like it or not. What about government? What does anybody think a legitimate function of government is? What's that? Security, okay. From what? For enforce contracts, okay. Anything else? Okay. Or to organize and protect the community, generally. Is that something the community could do on their own? Yes? So why does the government do that? I have another one over here. Yeah, he creates opportunities. What kind of opportunities? Healthcare, housing. Okay. So these are some good answers, and these are with government. You have to think there's always good and bad, right? Because if government was all bad, nobody would stand for it, and they would say, no, you guys are out. But there's always a lot of people who trust government, right? Because government does a little bit of good things to get everybody on their right side, right? They give out free health care. They give out protection. They do a lot of these things that are good for people. But what's interesting is at the same time, like Kyle was talking about, they create a monopoly. So while they're doing some of these things, they're telling other people they can't. Sometimes when it comes to protection, they're saying, we'll protect you, but you can't protect yourself. Because, you know, we don't want you fighting with each other. We don't know if it's a good fight. We don't know if you're the good guy or the bad guy. Only we can decide that because we're government. So what's really interesting is with government, they always find a way. They're good salesmen. They always find a way to convince you that you need them around and you can't do anything without them. And of course, with a monopoly, that's what you get used to. So for example, if there's a hospital and there's only one hospital and it's a government hospital, what do you get used to thinking? Government creates hospitals. Government is the only organization that creates hospitals because government is the only hospital that's there. That's what you know. That's what you've been taught. That's what you've memorized. But is that really the truth? If government didn't create that, would someone else have created it? Maybe. Someone else would do that. Because why? Because there's a need and somebody wants to provide that need. And so government, you know, just in the same way they protect monopolies, they'll do that. And sometimes they'll provide the actual service themselves. They'll pay for it with taxes. Sometimes they'll offer it cheaper than everybody else. Why? Because they print their own money. They don't need to worry about what it costs to run it, right? They don't need to worry about profit. They don't need to worry if it's losing money, if they're wasting money on things that they don't need to buy. They can be throwing money out the window and they don't care. So this is well, let me talk about another big one. So protection, right? We talk about protection for a community. What about even bigger for a country? Protection for a country. Because who can protect an entire country? I can't do it. You can't, this entire class together, we can't do it. The country is huge, right? So we need a giant military who can do this. But here's the problem. When you create a giant military, what does it do? Sometimes it just wants to go pick a fight where there is no fight. We see this in the United States a lot. We give lots and lots and lots of money to the government. We don't want to. A lot of us don't want to. Some people think we have to. We have to give more because there's so many things the government needs to fix. Most of the people in the United States don't even like the government. But they think if they keep giving them money and they keep voting for the right person, things will get fixed. This is another interesting thing in the US. Everybody votes for their own representatives, right? So there's a Congress which has a few hundred people in it. And all these people will sit there and fight over what should be legal, what should not be legal, how much you have to give up in your taxes and everything else. And everybody hates that entire system. Politicians are known as like the scum of the earth. Nobody likes them. All politicians are evil, vile people, except for the one that I voted for, right? Out of all those few hundred people in Congress and Senate and at different levels of government, it's always the person that the voter voted for that's the good guy, and it's everybody else is the problem. But the real problem is that we have this big concentration of power, and everybody keeps giving them money, just like a slot machine. They keep putting all the money in. And what do? They build an empire, a giant government that tells us it's going around the world and it's going to solve problems around the world. But what's it really doing? destroying it. It's bombing innocent people. Oh, there was a guy that we think might have been a terrorist at this wedding, so we blew up the whole wedding. That's what they do. And this is all paid for with tax money. People who want nothing to do with this war. How do you get so big of a military force that you can just go around the world killing innocent people? From airplanes, people who can't even shoot back at you, who can't defend themselves. How do you build an army that big? With taxes. You find a big enough group of people willing to pay taxes, and they think all that tax money is going for roads and hospitals and everything else. Very small piece, just to keep them happy, just to keep them paying those taxes. So one other thing I want to point out is concentration of power. And this is really all the same thing. So a lot of these people who are voting for their one good guy, they want to fix the world. I mean, everybody wants the world to be a better place, ultimately. Some people, of course, think the world would be a better place without certain people. So that's why they like to kill people. But most people in general want to make the world a better place somehow. And so what they do is, well, I'm just me. I'm just one person. I can't solve the world's problems. Let me give all my money to government. Let me get government to solve all the world's problems. They can do it. They tell me they have the smartest people. They tell me they're brilliant. They know everything. They have scientists. They have statistics. They have all this information. And people buy that. They're good salesmen. They tell us all this stuff is wonderful. So what happens is we end up with a concentration of power. In the United States, it's one big government organization. Now, I'm a software engineer, so I build computer systems. And I'm gonna go on a side story for a second here. When I build these systems, software, right? Banks, internet, websites, information, all of these systems, they always have to be available, right? What happens if the internet goes out at the bank? Nobody has access to their money, right? That would be a bad thing, right? So what do? You build two systems. You have two internet connections. What if the power goes out? The internet usually goes out too, right? So you put batteries on it. And what you're doing is you're creating redundant systems. So if one thing fails, there's always a backup. And you create this on every possible thing that can fail. We call this a single point of failure. We eliminate the single point of failure. When government starts building and it becomes one big system that works together, you have a single point of failure. So right now in the United States, I'll just say our leader, Trump, has decided he doesn't agree with Congress on a few things, and so they've shut down the government. So the government is shut down, supposedly. Still, I think it's something like 35 days now. Shut down. Why? Single point of failure. And what is it? The ability to write checks. So they have a military, they have hospitals, they have veterans that they're supposed to be giving health care to. They have the government is responsible for the security at all of the airports and some other places. The government they do a lot of things. I mean, if they went away, nobody would really notice. But they do a lot of things. And all of these employees have been told, you must keep working and you're not going to get paid. Nobody knows how long this is going to go on. Some people are estimating it's going to be going on until March. People are being forced to work without pay. What do you call that? Slavery. Forced labor. Slavery. So now, of course, they could just quit, right? Why don't they just quit? Any guesses? What's that? Some consequences? Yes. They'll feel some consequences. What's that? Well, If they quit, they don't care if they're fired. Prosecuted? Not likely, but depending on the place, they might. One of the conditions if they resign is they should leave, right? It makes sense. So why aren't they? So why are they? Would anybody here keep working if your boss told you we're not going to pay you, but you have to keep working? You'd all leave, right? So here's what's interesting. The government, because the government has an unlimited bank account, infinite amount of money, because they can always print it and can always steal more, right? They just can't write checks right now. But they're always guaranteed to give out more money later on, right? So these people are scared to quit because the skill that they're applying in some of these jobs, in most cases, the more skill you have, the more you get paid, right? So if you have very little skill or a very easy job, maybe you have a lot of skill, but you just like that the job is really easy and you don't have to do much, like the TSA employees who, this is when you get on the airplane, all they do is make sure you take your laptop out of your bag. Make sure you take your laptop out of your bag. Over and over, that's all they do. Make sure you don't have any food in there. Make sure you throw out your water bottles. That's all they do. And then you put your stuff into the x-ray scanner. Then there's another guy pressing the button on the x-ray scanner. And he looks at the picture. Okay, it doesn't look like a bomb. Okay, no guns. So very, very simple jobs, but because the government has unlimited money, they pay them a lot. They pay them very well. Not only that, they have pensions. So if you work there long enough without quitting, once you retire, you get more money for the rest of your life. Sounds great, right? Why would you quit? They're not paying me now, but I know they're going to have all this money soon. I'll just wait it out. I'll get the money, right? So this is why they don't quit, but it's a single point of failure. Now at the same time, they're working, but they're not working very hard. So I entered the United States a couple weeks ago, and I went through customs and immigration, which normally I do, which is their way of saying, this is our private club. We just want to make sure you're either part of our club or you're not planning on staying here for too long, because somehow the government decided that they get to control all of this land. It's theirs. They get to be the gatekeepers. I could invite any of you personally over to my house. It's not my decision. It's the government. How does that work? So my house is not my property because it's inside of your property? How did you get that property title? How did that become yours? So I enter into the US and I go through customs, and normally I show them my passport, they scan it, they look at it, they stare at it, they look at my face, they hold me there for 5 minutes asking questions. Are you bringing in any cigars or alcohol? Where did you go? Why did you go there? All these questions that should really be irrelevant. And this time, when the government was shut down and the employees were there, don't feel too bad for them, because not only are they going to get paid once they can start writing checks again, they're going to get paid for all the time that they worked. He looks at my passport and says, yeah, go through. That's it. So while they're supposed to be providing security for the country, because they keep telling us terrorists are trying to come into the country, which I don't personally believe. Not at the rate that they say anyway. And a lot of them are, well, I won't go down this conversation. A lot of them are pissed off because of what the U.S. has done. But they're supposed to be providing this security, and they're going to get paid, and they're going to get paid well for it, even though they're not really doing it. So this goes back to what I was saying about the single point of failure. They can't write the checks. And because they can't write the checks, these people are performing their job, they're providing help to society at a lower rate than what they should be doing. So here's the other interesting thing. You would think if you had, think of yourself as a business owner and you have an employee, and that employee isn't doing his job. It's kind of the same question as the TSA agent, right? The employee who's doing his job and not getting paid. What if he's getting paid and not doing his job? What would you do as the boss? Would you let him keep working for you? No, you would fire him and say, look, either start working or get out of here, right? Well, who's the boss of the government? The taxpayers. Can the taxpayers fire the government if the government is not doing what they're supposed to do? It would be nice if they could, but they can't. Why not? Because all of the government employees who collect all the money, who collect all the taxes, they're all still working too. They've created this fabulous, intricate system where every person in America has become an employee of the government's tax collecting system. They have systems where people rat on each other. They tell each other, oh, this guy's not paying taxes. Or an employer has to tell the government, oh, I gave this guy this much money, so this is how much he has to pay in taxes. And if you don't send that much money to the government, they're going to say, well, it says here, we know how much money you earned. You didn't pay enough. You got to send us more. So they know. All this is still going on. Every day, people are paying money to the government. The money is there. The government is holding the money hostage. They have all the money to pay all the employees. And what's possibly part of it is some people are saying, you know, they have to come up with a budget and they have to decide where this money is going to go, because it all goes into one bank account and we have to decide, okay, do we pay for this? Do we pay for that? And until we can decide, we just can't write any checks. Okay, that's understandable. You're still holding the entire country hostage. But what about things like the TSA? The TSA doesn't get paid for with general taxes like that. Whenever somebody buys a ticket into the United States or out of the United States or within the United States, there's a tax on the ticket that pays for the TSA. All that money is going directly to the TSA, and they have the money. It's not a question of taking budget from roads, from airports, from anything else. It's you have the money, you have the employees, write their checks. But they don't want to do that. What they're really trying to do is they're trying to make Americans suffer so that the two political parties can say, well, it's that party's fault. The reason you're suffering is because of that party. Then the other party's saying the same thing is because of that party why you're suffering. So they divide the country to hate each other so that they're attacking each other instead of looking at the government and saying, hey, the government created these problems. Why are we fighting each other when we should be fighting the government, when we should be fighting these politicians? Forget that one guy that you voted for. He's just as bad as all the others. So this is the single point of failure. How do you get rid of a single point of failure? You don't put everything in the same box. So if you had, let's say you have your music on a memory stick. Is that your only copy? Or do you keep a copy somewhere? Well, if you drop it in the water, it's gone, right? So you might keep an extra copy. You might figure out a way to get rid of that single point of failure. Now with government, before TSA took over the airlines, or before they took over airline security, that was all done by the airlines and by the airports. When you buy a ticket, you give money to the airline. The airline has to have somewhere to land the plane, right? So they give money to the airport for the right to use their airport, to take off and land, and to use their boarding gates to get people onto the plane. The money you pay for the ticket goes to the airline, which goes to the airport. The airlines want to be secure, so they give the money to an airport and say, hey, we want to make sure you have security. So the airport hires security. The airport hires security. Just like any other place would hire security. A bank hires security because they want to protect their vault, their money, everything else. So why not let the airport hire their own security? Because in this case right now, the government is telling us we're not secure because they have employees who don't feel like working because they're not getting paid, and somebody's going to get something onto a plane and something really bad is going to happen. And they're telling us it's not the government's fault, it's political parties, it's all this, but it's the government's fault. Because if the government had still permitted, if they had still allowed airports and companies to protect themselves, this wouldn't be an issue. Because when the government stops writing checks, the security would still be there, because those checks don't come from the government. So the government has created a problem, and now, as they say, the government is really great at breaking your legs and selling you crutches. They create a problem, which costs you money, and then they sell you the solution, which costs you more money. And usually that creates another problem, and they'll keep doing that. So I think my time's just about up. Do I have some time for some questions? Okay, does anybody have any questions? Do you have a microphone? Oh.
A reminder, members, that we are required to ask questions, not to make a lot of statements. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Indeed, I would like to raise some doubt about the way you had to speak about constitutionalism. The history of constitutionalism in USA and Uganda is different. The rationale is that in USA, after fighting for independence, George Washington led for one term and left it clear. Here in Uganda, after the colonialists giving the Ugandans their independence, they left a constitution behind which had no clear administrative processes. And the constitution of Uganda has been characterized by coup d'etats, that every leader that comes to power comes in with another constitution. Obote had an interim constitution. Amin used the legal notes. So you see that it is the NRM that impacted in the 1995 constitution, which is considering it to be that power belongs to people. However, the question that stands to challenge this constitution is that it was supposed to have term limits. So having repealed this kind of law from the constitution, it's where people have lacked their power. But otherwise, it would be the best way of people having power, other than earlier on, where the person who could come in and overthrow the government would impact in his own constitution, like what philosopher Hans Kelsen said. So I would say that the best constitution is where people have their power, but not the leader overstaying in power. Thank you very much.
It was just a comment, and I think, Mr. Mugabe, you get that. Probably in the next camp we shall have constitutionalism. And
Yes, thank you very much. Actually, a government without taxation is like a body without a skeleton. Yes. If you talk about the domestic policy, the foreign policy, government is supposed to be like that. What we're supposed to look for are the loopholes in taxation. The loopholes in taxation. So, if taxation is theft, then what is the alternative of taxation? Are you designing any kind of alternative that is reliable that can replace taxation? Thank you very much.
Okay, that's a good question.
Mr. Berman can take that, and
Yes.
we'll get some other tools.
So that's a very good question. And in the US, we have a joke because whenever you say taxation is theft, the first thing people say is, but without taxes, who will build the roads? Now, that's different here. But their assumption is that, okay, but the government is doing something with that money. So if we can't have taxation, how do we have government at all? And the answer to that is, there's two things I say. One is, I don't know, but I'm glad you asked. Now we're thinking. Because we can say, if we assume, oh, the government's going to raise money through taxation, and that's just the way it is, that's the way it always has been and the way it always will be, then we don't ask the question and we don't find the answer. So it's really important just to ask the question. Another thing I'll say is, you can raise the money any way you like, as long as you don't steal. Now think about this. The government does a lot of things. In the US, the government has a post office. They deliver mail, packages, letters, everything. For a while, this was funded by taxpayer money. you still have to pay them to do a service for you. You give them money and they deliver a letter for you. They made it illegal for other people to do the same. Nobody else can take money to deliver a letter in the US, only the government. So the government created a monopoly. Now, at one point, a few years ago, they said, okay, look, we're providing a service and we're taking money. Why don't we at least make this one part of government operate on its own? We have a lot of post offices where people can go buy stamps, but they sell $5 worth of stamps every year. Why do we have to pay employees to keep that branch open? Why do we have to pay the rent and the overhead and electricity and everything? And that entire building makes $5 every year. And so they said, okay, let's close down some of these places. Let's turn this into a profitable business. And they did it for a while. I think now it's running on tax money again. So there are ways that government can raise money without having to take it by force. But we have to start asking these questions. Some other examples are toll roads, where the government builds a road and the people who actually use it will pay a small toll to use it. So in the US, when you have two big cities that are 100 miles apart, sometimes the government will just come in and say, hey, we're going to pay and we're going to build a whole road. Sometimes what some other people do is, not from the government, they build a second road and it's got less traffic on it. And people are happy to pay to use that other road just because it takes them a little bit faster. So government can charge for the services that it provides when it's providing services. Another interesting thing is when it comes to defending the country, so a national defense, what's really interesting is there are countries that defend themselves by training everybody to know how to use a gun. So everybody becomes a member of the military, but they're not there by force. They're not full-time, going into battle every single day. But when a real threat comes along, everybody says, okay, this is a real threat. We need to defend our country. And the people who are capable of it, they join and they volunteer for the army and they fight off this enemy. But they're not constantly, like the US does, they're not constantly training thousands and thousands and recruiting new military and engaging other enemies who aren't a threat to us on the other side of the world. And that's not possible when you have a volunteer army. Because think about it, if everybody in this room, if you were part of a volunteer army or a militia, and you were trained to defend this country if it were ever invaded, under attack by somebody else, would you just go and fight another country just because you felt like it? Probably not. You'd be risking your life. You'd be doing something morally wrong. You'd be killing other innocent people. Nobody would want to do that. But now that decision is in your hands because it's not in the government's hand. It's again, single point of failure. If you have a big military that's already funded, that's already got soldiers on payroll, and it just takes one person to say, we're going to attack. No questions asked. Everybody follow orders. Get on the trucks. We're going this way, and start shooting. That's how innocent people get killed.
Let's take two rounds of. Now, Mr. Jerome wants to teach us some taxation. Huh? Let's take this colleague of ours and the other one, and Gilbert. We are taking those three, and then we shall see what to do next.
Thank you. I'm Ian Polite once again. I want to get your take. From your presentation, I'm quoting and I'm comparing with our Ugandan present situation. There is a continuous, I think I will call it global, also a global issue where there is an imbalance in as far as taxation charge or how taxation is collected. Now that at sometimes taxation we see is directly trying to affect an individual or even companies. In Uganda, we had a tax that was established, which was not common, and it was mainly to streamline the media, and it caused dust around here. But now, what is your take, or what should we do to stand out and defend a balanced taxation charges? Because we see there are people who are favored and unfavored, and It is one way oppressing and some way favoring the rest. So what is your take? What should we take home on far as
So you're
standard
saying
for tax?
some people like the new tax and some people don't?
Some are benefiting, others are exempted. So what is your
Okay.
take on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so some people say that the government's job is to keep everybody on the payroll, right? So government employees usually love the government, right? They don't care if the government's taxing because that's where they get their money from. Other people, they're not paying the taxes, they're exempt or they get benefits. So sometimes the government, I'll give you an example. In the US, the government will give money to the corn industry so that farmers who grow corn get free money to grow more corn. So those people love government, even though the government comes back around and takes that money from their taxes. They get that little bit and they think it's wonderful. So the government's role is to, like I said, they give a little bit of something to everybody, but they take a lot more. So I think what's really important is to make people realize that usually what's happening is they're giving more to the government than they're getting back. They're giving a lot more. And for some people, it's going to be different. For some people, they're getting a lot more back from government. Those are the people who have friends in government. They're more connected to that. Obviously, they make a lot more. So what I think is really a good strategy is to find the people who are giving more to government and getting less in return, and talking to them and spreading the message that way. And I like to use taxation as theft just to, as it becomes more popular and more people start saying it, more people are able to resist any new taxes. So that's a really good way also. Does that answer? Okay. We have another,
Thank you. Is it the case, do they always account for the tax in your country? As in, does the government provide accountability? First off, that's my first question. Plus here, we don't raise the accountability. Like as he has said, the recent tax that was imposed on the media, we have not yet seen accountability. We don't know who is even collecting that money. We don't know even how much they have collected so far. We're having a tendency whereby tax is being collected. In fact, 60% of the Ugandan budget is from tax. But here is a situation whereby we find that 2% of the Ugandan budget during the reign of Prime Minister Amama Mbabazi, the former, he stole 2% of the Ugandan budget. That wasn't enough money to fund him for a way. Anyway, with the constitution, I don't always like it when the lawyers talk about the constitution and then they're telling us, fine, the current one was signed in 1995, and maybe it partially gives us power, though it says power belongs to the hands. Power is in the hands of the people. That's according to the first sections. But then this is a constitution that was designed by the current government, first of all, and in addition to that, it was made in 1995 when the current government was in power. And it was made by the very person who is still ruling today. That very person was still heard saying, don't joke with me, I can rule either with or without the constitution. So it's someone's book that can be edited. That was the second edition. We're waiting for the third edition. We don't have a constitution in Uganda, according to me.
So your first question is about, you said accountability. So accountability is a funny thing, especially when you're asking the government to be accountable for itself. You're asking anybody to be accountable for themselves, right? Because let me ask you this. Do you have the right to steal from me? No, right? Okay, what about him? Together, two of you. Do you have the right to steal from me? What about everybody at this table? Do you have the right to steal from me together? Now, what happens if you take that notepad and you write out some fancy words and you say, we're going to govern this room, and that gives us the right to steal from somebody. And these are all the rules that apply to that, and this is how we're going to spend the money. Does that make it okay to steal? So this is what they do with the Constitution and with laws, and this is why in a lot of places the laws are very complicated. They're written in a language that most people don't understand on purpose. They don't want us to understand them. Sometimes they just make them so big that if you can understand a couple words, it doesn't matter, because this sentence right here says you can do something, but then 5,000 pages later it says, oh yeah, but that only applies to such and such. So according to accountability, any of those lawyers who are working for government, they can say, well, it matches all the rules in the book because they created those rules. And you and I might try to look at 1 or 2 pages of that and say, okay, well, this sentence makes sense on its own, not knowing everything else that it's connected to, but I don't have time to read these other 5,000 pages. So when you ask them to be accountable, what can you do? They're just going to say, well, according to all the rules, according to the Constitution and everything else, this is all legit. So it really, you can't just use the word accountability to figure out what's right and what's wrong. You have to understand, what is the relationship between you and government? Are you free? Or are you bound by their rules? And does their constitution and their laws that they wrote give them any special rights that they didn't already have? So if they didn't have the right to steal before, does that give them the right to steal now that they have a constitution? And once you understand those questions, then you'll start to look at the accountability question a little bit differently.
Receive the last question. Probably, Mr. Jerome, you will find Mr. Berman somewhere, and then you have that question. Please, Gilbert, you have less than a minute to ask.
Thank you so much. I think mine is not asking in particular, but I also love to say this out, maybe in response to someone's question about constitutionalism. You see, for Uganda's democracy, someone said one time that it is better to be ruled by a bad tyrant than to live in a bad democracy. That's Plato. I think you should try to view that. Then for him, this Mr. Bama, I think I'm so loved that I want to applaud you by making a few remarks about taxation. I think for taxation is not bad, but the only role of government or by government in taxation is only to formulate good policies for the country. But what are policies? Policies, as I may maybe give some small brief about policies, these are the programs and plans that the government may run, rules and regulations that are set for the government activities, let them be governmental or individual state bodies or activities. Then for taxation to maybe third world countries like Uganda, it is always good for governments in third world countries to make taxations in a way that in this world of globalization where the US, the superpowers are calling us to make free entry or exit for trading, where you find the multinational enterprises like Coca-Cola or Pepsi, they mention them. They want us to pave way for these companies to come and make profits. And if governments don't come up to make taxation, these people will be stealing our wealth, because this is the only way we can, or government can get a portion on these benefits or these profits these multinational companies have made. But if governments of third world countries don't tax, like you've said, that taxation is safety, then particularly third world countries will not have any portion on these profits that are made by these multinational enterprises. Thank you so much. But I also love to say this, for Ugandan government or maybe the African states, if I called them maybe Mugabe, Socrates, or John, and I don't put titles like sir, there will be a problem. But to him and maybe Mr. Trump, you can even call them Mr. Trump, call him Mr. Bama. You're free to do anything, but not for African countries that they will need titles, maybe call them His Excellency and stuff. Thank you so much.
Sure. I just want to respond to that, because that's a very good point about stealing resources, and we see that all over the world. Big companies stealing resources from everywhere. In the United States, they do it too. Of course, you have a lot of resources here, so they want them. But here's an interesting point. You have government, and they're still taking the resources. But what's government doing to stop them? They're charging a tax. So what does that really do? So these big companies that are coming in to take the resources, they're still getting them, but the people who are taxing you are getting rich. Not just from the big corporations, but from you. They're getting rich from everybody. So those people they're stealing as well, no? So you have theft is wrong, right? Companies coming in to steal resources is a bad thing, but you can't stop theft by creating more theft. So this is like the question of, without taxes, how do we pay for certain things? It's a good question, but the easy answer is always, how do you stop someone from doing something? Shoot them. But is that always the right answer? So can we find a better way to stop someone from stealing resources without having to create more theft?
We thank Mr. Berman, and may we indeed give a round of applause to Mr. Berman. And